Hi, I'm Jeet here of The Nation magazine. This is my YouTube channel where I'll be talking about politics and books and culture. If you like the video, please subscribe. And there's also a link below as to where you can find my writing for The Nation. So, usually I think I'll probably be covering less popular books or more esoteric books, which are the type I like. But this for this episode, I'm actually going to talk about a bestseller. This is the just published book by Kamala Harris, 107 Days, which I think in its first week has sold 350,000 copies. The publisher says on its path to becoming the best selling memoir of 2025. Now, I have to say that the politician's memoir is not a genre that I particularly like. These are books I maybe read more for duty than pleasure. I mean, they're often self serving, calculated, and full of propaganda and talking points. There are exceptions. I mean, people often talk about the memoirs of Ulysses Grant as being a classic. I have to say that Richard Nixon's various nonfiction books, although coming from a very squalid and vicious point of view, do have the sort of candor of the Machiavellian, someone who revels in his political battles. Now, with Kamala Harris, and I think the Nixon analogy I just made was not made haphazardly. I think, interesting enough, she finds herself in the same position as Richard Nixon in 1960. And she makes this comparison herself towards the end, where she says that she, like Nixon in 1960 and Al Gore in the year 2000, had the um, unfortunate situation of having to certify the election she had lost, because that's one of the jobs of the vice president. And Nixon in 1960 had lost an election and was engaged in a political project of rehabilitation because he was not done with politics. Even after losing the governorship of California and saying you won't have Richard Nixon to kick around anymore, he actually did have always political ambitions. In 1962, he published a book called Six Crises, which look at various setbacks he had suffered in his political career and difficult situations, with the idea of making a case that this actually made him a better politician, that he's hardened and he's ready to fight again. And so I think Harris, vice president who is elevated to the nomination, loses, but is still very young. Like Nixon, a Californian. Like Nixon, actually, someone who's sort of politically ambiguous, who always kind of goes for what they think the sort of median member of their political party supports. And like Nixon, someone who cultivated a great base of support in the party. Nixon, throughout the 1950s, would always be going on what he called, the chicken circuit in every midterm, going around the country campaigning for people, building up that base of support. Kamala Harris did the same thing in 2022, as she mentions in her memoir. I'm not saying Kamala Harris is Nixon, but like the situation is not dissimilar. And one of the things that Nixon did in Six Crises is, and it's a subtle thing, but he had to deal with his relationship with Eisenhower. Now, on the one hand, he owed everything to Eisenhower. Eisenhower had elevated him from the Senate to being vice presidential candidate, making Nixon a national figure. And Eisenhower was very popular. Eisenhower, in many ways, had subtly been undermining Nixon for a long time. Actually, going back to even 1952, where there was a lot of talk about kicking Nixon off the ticket, and Nixon had to fight for his political life with the Checkers speech. And in his book Six Crises, Nixon, in a clever Machiavellian way of getting in digs, lets you know that Eisenhower was not always very helpful in the 1960 election, and that Eisenhower, in some ways, was not quite the nice man that people thought he was. And it's subtly done, but it's there, and it's actually makes very interesting reading. And I think now Kamala Harris is elevated by Joe Biden, owes a lot to him. Is has a very good case that she was undermined by Joe Biden, but Joe Biden is not as popular as Eisenhower ever was, and certainly he's not popular now. He's actually one of the most reviled figures in American political life, not just by Republicans but by many Democrats. And I think that what she does in the book, and which is very interesting, is makes out a plausible case that the disaster of 2024 was Joe Biden's disaster. And I think she kind of has to tread a line. She does say that she and Joe were in political alignment. She does have this kind of subtle and I would say not convincing claim that Joe Biden was had the capacity to be president, was always alert, but was faltering in his communication skills, and therefore was justified in not running again. I think she and others in the Biden White House have to have this line that he always had the capacity, and I'm not sure that that's fully convincing. But I think she has legitimate complaints and she does actually make them. And I think that's what makes this book interesting. And that is the interesting part of the book, her relationship with Joe Biden. She starts off with the disastrous debate with a little bit of cruelty, quotes some verbatim statement that he made, which brings out his incoherence, and gets at a few digs at the people around Biden, Anita Dunn, Mike Donilon, who this is very clear in this book, were kind of cooking the poll numbers and whispering delusional things to Biden. Jill Biden is also someone who's I don't think comes across very well in this book. Not explicitly stated, but there's a sense that she's someone who's very bitter and unwilling to face political reality. When he steps down, Kamala Harris has to secure his support for her becoming the nominee. After Biden stepped down, there was this kind of question, well, should the party go with Kamala Harris? Should they try to have a very quick primary? As people like Nancy Pelosi were pushing for, Kamala Harris, in her very first conversation with Joe Biden, says, Joe, you gotta get fully behind me. And she also makes the convincing case that she had the delegates, partially because she had been a very loyal party worker. And the theme of the book really is loyalty. As vice president, you're supposed to be loyal. At least in the modern era, the vice presidents are supposed to be loyal, and that makes it a thankless position. But that loyalty is a one-way street. That Joe Biden makes it very clear he and his inner circle had mistreated Kamala Harris as she was vice president. That they didn't give her jobs that could have highlighted her talent. They actually gave her like a very difficult post of like looking after border issues. They were allegedly running her down in the press. This is all stuff that had been kind of rumored about, but it's good to have her, say this on the record. It's a recurring theme in the book that Biden is always there to sabotage things. One thing, that she makes clear is the difficulty she had in separating herself from Biden. Now, I'll say this as someone who was doing a political column for The Nation last year during the election year. I and many others were writing that she has to separate herself out from Joe Biden, that Biden is an anchor around her neck, and also that the issue of Gaza is an anchor around her neck. And the her book is very useful and gratifying that she vindicates this analysis. Like, she basically has one of her top advisors, David Plouffe, who's had been an Obama advisor as well. People hate Joe Biden, but that analysis that she would have been well advised to separate herself from Biden, I think, is vindicated. And she says strikingly that Biden was incapable of showing towards Palestinians the empathy he had towards Ukrainians. One can step back and ask, well, what does that mean? What does it mean to be empathetic to this one group of people and not the other? I don't think it says anything good about Joe Biden. Now, stepping back a little bit further, this reflects badly on Biden, but it also reflects badly on Harris. And I don't think she's maybe too candid for her own good, because she makes very clear the sort of a political logic of separating out from Biden. But then she never was able to do that. And in fact, her criticisms of herself are about communication. And she talks about how she went on The View and was asked if she would have done anything different from Biden over the last 4 years. And she said nothing, and then there was a break. And then she came back and said, well, I would have maybe appointed a Republican, which is for the cabinet, which is saying, in essence, she would have ran a more conservative administration than Joe Biden. Well, that just, to my mind, doesn't cut it. The On the Gaza issue, like, yes, she recognizes his lack of empathy, but I think she also has a more flaw herself in that she thinks that simple expressions of empathy would have done the trick. She basically literally uses this tired old Clintonian phrase of "I see you and I hear you," and I don't think she recognized it. 2020 people didn't want to be hear that I have empathy. I see you. I hear you. They wanted the Israeli onslaught against Gaza, the genocide, to stop. She's not able to recognize that, even though her account makes it very clear that the Gaza issue was a hugely costly one for her campaign. As to why she didn't cut off from Joe Biden, there's actually a very interesting story in the book, and it takes place in September 10th, 56 days before the election. This is the day of the debate with Donald Trump, her one occasion to really shift public opinion. It's a major event. She had been preparing for it for a long time. Very few people have debated Donald Trump successfully. A big, tense night. And then, before the debate starts, she gets this call out of the blue from Joe Biden. At first, he has sort of small talk. How you doing, kiddo? I know you'll do good. And she's puzzling to herself, why is he calling me? This is not the time for this. And then he says, "Are you going to Philadelphia before the election?" And she doesn't know what he's talking about. Like, Pennsylvania is a big swing state, but she'd probably be going to other parts of Pennsylvania to where Democrats are weaker to get out the vote. But she doesn't know have an answer to that. And then he like, sort of says, "My brother has been out in Philadelphia, and he's been talking to this is almost a literal quote, some real power brokers out there." And that phrase very amusing to me. He's been talking to Robert Moses, like the old school machine politics, whatever, who are the power brokers in Philadelphia. Anyway, case he named some names, and he said, "My brother has been saying that some of these people are not sure they should support you because they've been hearing rumors that you're running me down. I know that's not the case. They're just worried that your campaign might be trying to put daylight between you and me, and just thought you should know that." Now, I mean, obviously, that conversation was a veiled threat. It's like, you better be loyal and you better continue to praise me and not separate yourself out from me, because otherwise, I still have supporters within the party who can make your life hell. Some of these supporters are in swing states, and they will sabotage your campaign. So Joe Biden was basically saying that he was willing to sabotage her campaign and let Donald Trump win rather than be criticized from within his own party. And that's a remarkable story. It's really a story of sort of selfishness on a paramount scale. And Joe Biden does not come across well. So it's interesting that, Kamala Harris, unlike Joe Biden, has a future in the Democratic Party. And she sees that future as involving separating herself out finally from Joe Biden. And the theme of loyalty duplicates itself. She was too loyal to Biden. And then she mentions Biden was very loyal to Benjamin Netanyahu, who betrayed him and who preferred Trump anyways and did everything he could to elect Trump. So you have this chain of misplaced loyalty. Her misplaced loyalty to Biden, Biden's misplaced loyalty to Netanyahu, all of which cost the Democrats the election. And I think it's actually good to have this out there. The cost of this alliance with the Israel, this policy of the bear hug, and of nearly unwavering support for the Israeli state. I think Democrats should know what the cost is. And this book, written by an establishment Democrat, makes it clear that the costs are very high. How convincing is it to rehabilitate Kamala Harris, which is clearly the intent? I mean, I'm not a hater. Many likable things about her. She has a real joie de vivre. Her passion for the people around her and for enjoying life is in the book. There was a critique by Nazreen Malik in The Guardian, which goes into some of the more negative stuff that I didn't talk about in my own review. There's a kind of lot of celebrity name dropping of people like Oprah Winfrey, and not a lot of self criticism. I mean, there's self criticism, but it's always on the level of messaging. Like, I gave this interview and I didn't quite convey, or I wasn't able to show people how wonderful like our plans were. And I think there's a deeper criticism to be made, because were those plans really so wonderful? I mean, a lot of what she was talking about seemed warmed over neoliberalism, these tax credits. And particularly, she says the child tax credit would have been the most effective anti poverty program in history. And I have to be frank about this. As I think sending money to families with children is actually very effective. But what they were offering, this form of tax credit, has two problems. One is it doesn't really do anything for the very poorest of the poor, who are the people you want to help because they don't pay taxes. They're off the grid. And so on that level, it just doesn't do what it says it does. And even on a sort of design level, if you have a child born in January, you won't get the tax credit for much longer than someone who has a child born in December. So that's the typical inefficiencies of these kind of like neoliberal programs that are a little too smart for their own good. And I really would have liked her to think more about her program and why it didn't convince people, apart from Joe Biden. And she speaks very warmly about her brother in law, Tony West. It says he's politically astute. And she doesn't reflect on the reporting that Tony West had a very high role in her campaign, was the liaison with Wall Street because he's a senior executive at Uber. And he worked very hard for them to tone down the economic populism, to tone down the talk about price gouging. And Biden was an anchor around the party, yes. There were other things that cost her the election, and I don't see her reflecting on that. And I think that more than her kind of celebrity mongering, I mean, I think that's really the problem with her as a politician. You don't really get a strong sense of a real ideology. She keeps emphasizing she's a prosecutor. And again, I think that what she doesn't realize is that she really came across as a very pro system person at a period in American history where large parts of the population are anti system. And I don't think Democrats understand well enough. Like going back to 2008, the times that they won with Obama, two elections in a row, with Biden in 2020, where when they could cast themselves as the anti system alternative to a Republican Party that is pro system. And I don't think she quite understands that a lot of the way she positions herself did damage. So, will she rehabilitate herself? Clearly, the sales of this book indicate, there's an audience for her message. I think people who dismiss her skills as a politician do actually underestimate her. She does actually have a real charisma. She really does convey someone who has a great vitality and love of life. And that's certainly better than, the walking corpse that was Joe Biden. But is that enough? I don't know. I think what one would like to see, and maybe she can never make that leap, is a reflection on how the sort of corporatist nature, the reliance on Wall Street donations hurt the party. At the end, there's a glimmer of this where she says her whole life she believed in working within the system, and now she's seeing that maybe that doesn't work. So that leaves an open question: like, what would an anti-system Kamala Harris look like? I don't know. I'm not sure. I think she can quite do it, but I think that's the broader question for all of us. Would I recommend reading this book? I mean, as a reviewer, I think the Joe Biden stuff, and you can get that in the first 30 or 40 pages. Very good. I think there's some glimmers of her personal life with her husband Doug that are very interesting and revealing. I think uh, a lot of the book is frankly a slog. I mean, it's like on an almost day by day basis. It's 107 days, and she covers many, if not most, of those days. And a lot of it just I gave a speech here, I gave a speech there. I think if you read a good review, you can get all the juice that you need from the book. I honestly, the book surprised me with the amount of interesting material it had about her relationship with Biden, but I don't quite know if that's enough to make it a good book. Take it out of the library and skim through the good parts. In any case, thank you for listening to my review. Again, feel free to subscribe, hit the like button, and we will continue talking about politics and books on this YouTube channel.